Hello, my name is lesfleursdelanuit. I'm a photographer who specializes in macro photography and artistic editing. This is the third part of a multi-part tutorial that will show you how to create a dreamy, minimalistic edit. In this tutorial, I will continue showing you how to minimize the distractions in your background and foreground. This is a multi-step process that involves separating your image into its component parts, which we did in the previous video. In this tutorial, I will show you a method on how to realistically blur your background. We will first remove extraneous elements from the background and foreground using the spot healing tool and the content aware fill tool. Then we are going to use a blurring algorithm to blur the background. Okay, let's get started. Now the first thing we're going to do is remove any extraneous elements from the background and foreground. To do this, if the object is small, we're going to remove it with the spot healing brush tool. If the object is large, we are going to use the lasso selection tool in combination with content aware fill. So we're going to proceed in a similar manner as we did when we removed the subject from the background in the previous video. So the first thing that we want to remove is this squiggle up here. Since it's pretty small, we're going to use the spot healing brush tool. We want to make sure that we are on the background layer, which I am. And then I'm going to select the spot healing brush tool. Now this tool functions like any other brush tool. That is, you paint over the area that you want affected by the tool. So in this particular case, I would like to paint over the squiggle. Now whenever I use this tool, I try to make sure that the diameter of the brush is just slightly larger than the diameter of the object that I'm trying to remove. In this case, I would say that is true, so I'm not going to make my brush size any larger or smaller. I'm just going to paint over the squiggle. So I'm going to make sure my background is selected, and then I'm going to paint over the squiggle with the spot healing brush tool. And that looks really good, so I'm just going to move on. The next thing that I would like to remove are these flowers right here. This is a fairly large object, so I'm going to use the lasso tool in combination with content aware fill. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a rough selection around these flowers, and I'm going to make sure that the edge of my selection has a little bit of space between the edges of my flowers. So I'm going to do that. As you can see, there is some space between my selection and the edge of the flower. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the content aware fill tool in order to remove it. So I'm going to go to edit, fill. In this window that pops up where it says contents, I want to make sure that content aware is selected. That is the most important part. Okay, I'm going to press OK and I'm going to wait for it to do its thing. I'm going to press deselect. As you can see, that did a perfect job. If you didn't know those flowers were there before, you would have no idea that they were there now. So the next thing that I want to remove is this object in the background that I'm circling with the mouse. Now, to do this, I'm going to turn my subject layer off. This isn't because the removal process is going to somehow affect the subject layer. It's just because I find the subject layer kind of distracting. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the subject layer off. Now, because this is a fairly large object, I'm going to use the lasso tool in conjunction with content aware fill to remove it. So I'm going to make sure the lasso tool is selected, and I'm going to once again make a rough selection of this object. And as before, I want to make sure that there is some space between the edge of the object and the edge of the selection I'm making, like so. This is a pretty good rough selection. So now I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, where it says Contents. I want to make sure, as before, that it says Content Aware. Now I'm going to press OK. So that did a pretty good job removing that object. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn the subject layer back on. As you can see, we've cleaned the background up pretty well. And the subject layer and the background layer, they blend together fairly well, but we're going to go ahead and blend the subject into the background a little bit more. To do so, we're going to select the subject layer. In this case, we want to make sure we are working with the mask and not the layer itself. So right now we have the layer itself selected. So we want to go ahead and select the mask. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and paint over the mask with a soft white brush. So we're going to select the brush tool. We're going to make sure that we have white selected. We're going to set our hardness to 0%. And then we're just going to go ahead and we're going to paint over the flowers and the bud in the background. So there are multiple ways to soften the edge of your mask. However, this is my preferred method of doing it. It gives me a little bit more flexibility. It's really good to know multiple ways of doing things, because then you can decide for yourself which method works best for you. Okay, I think that looks good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to blend the subject into the background a little bit more. To do so, we're going to soften the edges of the mask. We're going to do this by selecting the subject layer and using the brush tool to paint over the edges of the mask with a soft brush. Now, to do this, we need to select the brush tool, make sure we're working with white. We want the hardness of our brush to be 0%. We want to ensure that not only are we on the subject layer, but that we are working with the mask and not the layer itself. In this case, we are working with the layer itself, so we want to go ahead and select the mask. And then we want to make sure the opacity is set to 100% because we want to make sure that we're using white and not something lighter than that. And then we're going to go ahead and paint over the edges of our mask. Now, since we're working with our mask, it does not necessarily appear as if we're doing that much, but I will deselect or turn off the background and the subject layer and show you that we have indeed softened the edges. Now, there are multiple ways of softening the edges of your mask. This is my preferred method because it allows me some flexibility. But of course, there are other ways, and it's best to know as many ways as you can and choose the method that works best for you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off the background layer and also the original layer. And as you can see, we have softened the edges a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and soften the edges down here a little bit more. And then I'm going to turn the background and the original layers back on. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now we're going to discuss a method for blurring the background. The first thing we will do is we're going to create a duplicate layer of the background layer. So we're going to right click on the background layer and choose duplicate layer. where it says as, we're going to enter blur. So we want this to be the medium intensity blur layer. Now we're going to use the blur gallery to apply the blur to this layer. This is because the NVIDIA GPU installed on this laptop accelerates and improves the performance of the blur gallery. So we're going to go to Filter, Blur Gallery. We're going to choose Field Blur. As I said before, we want a medium intensity blur for this particular layer. So we're just going to select something in the middle. Maybe something a little bit less. So 106 pixels seems pretty good to me. Now we're going to press OK. Now, as you can see, that performed relatively quickly. Now, most people choose to use Gaussian blur because it performs much faster than something like Blur Gallery usually does. But with the GPU on this laptop, it actually performs really quickly. So now what we're going to do is we're going to attach a mask to the blur layer. To do so, we're going to click this button down here. And now we have attached a mask. So what we're going to do now is we're going to paint over the areas of the image that we do not want affected by the blur layer. So I'm going to go in with a black brush. I'm going to make it significantly larger than what it is right now. So I like that. And then I'm going to paint over the areas I do not want blurred. So before we go ahead and do this, we want to make sure that we are indeed working with the mask and not the layer itself. So it looks that we actually are on the layer itself, so we want to select the mask. And then we want to reselect black. So now we're going to paint in the areas that we do not want blurred. So I do not want this bokeh blurred right here. So I'm painting it back in. And I'm going to paint in the bokeh balls back here. And some more of the bokeh up here. Actually, we're going to paint some of that bokeh back out. There. So it's a little bit smoother. So we want the blurred parts of the image to blend well with the non-blurred parts of the image. So what we're going to do is we're going to blur the mask itself. So we're going to go to Filter, Blur. We want to ensure the mask itself is selected, and it is. And then we're going to go to Gaussian Blur. And we're going to set it to something a little bit lower. So what this will do is it will add a nice transition between the parts of our image that are affected by the blur and the parts that are not. So now we're going to add the higher intensity blur layer. So what we're going to do is we're going to make another duplicate of the background layer. So we're going to select the background layer, right click, duplicate layer, name this blur number 2. Higher intensity, press OK, move it above the last blur layer. Now once again, we're going to use the blur gallery to blur this layer. So we're going to go to Filter, Blur Gallery, Field Blur. We're going to select something on the higher end of the spectrum. So we're going to click towards the right. Okay. I like that degree of blur, so we're just going to press OK. As before, that was pretty quick. As I said before, people tend to use Gaussian blur because it used to perform much faster than the blur gallery did. But because of the GPU installed on this computer, the blur gallery actually performs pretty quickly. So we're once again going to attach a mask to this layer. So we're going to click right here. And we've attached a mask. However, this time we are going to invert the mask. That is, we're going to make it all black instead of all white. In order to do this, we are going to press Control I on a PC or Command I on a Mac. Okay, so the reason I did that is because I only really want a tiny area of the image affected by this blur. So we're actually going to paint on this mask with white instead of black. So what we're doing this time is we're painting the part of the image that we want blurred back in. Okay, so I only really want the upper right-hand corner affected by this blur layer. So I'm going to go ahead and paint that back in. I want to make sure that my paintbrush is set to white, and I want to ensure that I'm working with the mask. So once again, click on the mask, and now paint it back in. And now once again, I'm going to add a blur to the mask itself in order to make sure that there's a nice transition between the parts of the image that are affected by the blur and the parts that are not. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I will keep the radius as it is, so at 184.9 pixels, and press OK. So I know that this video was a little bit more complex than the other videos, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to NVIDIA's channel for more videos like this.